But instead, I did want to take the opportunity to go over a little political philosophy to expand on something I was talking about earlier. So what I was talking about earlier was, the fact that a common stereotypical narrative regarding the American Revolution is that, oh, it was like this big revolution well, it was this democratic revolution against the tyranny of the British monarch. But it wasn't. Uh, the American colonists didn't have a huge problem with the monarchy. That's not what was seen as tyrannical. Even by the 18th century, the British monarchy was already a heavily constitutional monarchy. Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, the powers of the monarch had already been significantly limited, and Parliament was made by far the more. And Parliament is especially its lower house was a more democratically representative kind of legislative body. And so the issue was more in the 18th century. The British government was like by far the most liberal and democratic government, or one of the most liberal and democratic governments in the Western world. So the issue was not like, oh, there's this tyrannical king who's ruling and lording over us with, like absolute power, because it wasn't. Just like the monarchy today in Britain, it was already a largely ceremonial, kind of office that did not really wield a whole lot of political power. If anything was viewed as tyrannical by the American colonists, it was the British Parliament. And why was that? Because even though Parliament was the one passing these taxes that they were getting hit with, not the monarch, Parliament was. But even though Parliament was the one doing it, the American colonists did not have representation in that Parliament. They didn't have the ability to elect their own ministers of Parliament to the British Parliament. And so this is where you get this famous phrase American revolutionaries like to say, no taxation without representation. That was what that meant. That, the Parliament shouldn't have a right, the British Parliament shouldn't have a right to tax us if we don't have a right to elect ministers of Parliament representing us in that Parliament. That was what really the problem was. And not the idea that there's this constitutional monarch as the head of state. And in fact, it's for that very reason that various founding fathers wanted to preserve a monarchical government, a constitutional monarchy, but they wanted to preserve a monarchical government. When even after the move was increasingly towards independence, because remember, like we discussed earlier, a lot of them didn't even necessarily agree that they were fighting for full-on independence. But even after that became more the move, um, a lot of them, it's like Alexander Hamilton specifically famously proposed crowning George Washington as the monarch of America, and then setting up Congress as like the equivalent of the British Parliament, and then just not even bothering with a president and just having the executive be the monarch, just crowning a new monarch. I mean, Alexander Hamilton's the one that really comes to my mind, but there were multiple even founding fathers and American revolutionaries who were totally on board with that. The issue was not monarchy. The issue was not monarchy, especially not the very constitutional monarchy that the British had. The issue was not having representation in the parliament. But this leads into a broader discussion about, I think, things like monarchism, and some misunderstandings people have about it. I wanted to go over a little bit to do with a political philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a famous book called Leviathan and famously advocated for monarchy in the early modern period. Um, and I find this stuff kind of really interesting. I think we've kind of been raised in a society and culture where we're just told from a very, very young age that democracy is the only like legitimate government form and monarchy bad because don't you know the American colonists revolted against monarch. But I think for that reason, unfortunately, things like monarchism people don't take as seriously, or they just kind of have a gut instinct to want to dismiss. But there are some legitimately very interesting philosophical reasons and justification for taking something like a monarchical form of government a lot more seriously. And Thomas Hobbes is a great way to do that. So I just thought maybe building a little bit in theme with this like American Revolution, this American Revolution kind of history little special we've done here in honor of Independence Day. I thought it'd be interesting if we maybe built on that and considered the idea of monarchism philosophically, and why, again, not all of the philosophers were necessarily, I'm sorry, philosophers, not all of the American revolutionaries and even founding fathers were necessarily opposed to monarchism. Why it's maybe worth considering a little more seriously. I think I've explained this on stream before. Yeah, it does seem scammy, and in fact, I've talked before about how Plato, considered democracy the absolute worst form. Actually, this might be worth bringing up first. Is it's not like democracy is just this uncontested great system without its criticisms. Plato famously regarded democracy as the second worst form of government out of them all, second only to tyranny, which is the absolute worst. But democracy was the second worst, and in fact, he regarded it as the system of government that was most likely to give rise to tyranny. And that's because there's an interesting thing. I think people a lot of times will conflate something like monarchy with tyranny, and they'll just assume that a tyrant is just by definition somebody who has this sort of absolute power. But in Plato's view, that's not actually what made a tyrant. What made a tyrant was not how much power you had. And again, I talked about this in my Light Yagami Analyzing Evil stream. But um, Plato regarded the philosopher kings who should rule, the guardians, um, and he believed they should rule because based on merit, right? Because they were the wisest and most virtuous and most capable to rule. But he believed that those, once you figured out who was the wisest and most capable to rule, you should give them like a huge amount of power. There shouldn't necessarily be like checks and balances. They should just have like pretty unrestrained power to rule. Because the issue in Plato's view is not how much power you have, and that's an assumption that I think is worth cross-examining, and what I think something like Hobbes or someone like Hobbes is really good at kind of cross-examining, because this is the assumption I think is very popular in like the Western world in the 21st century, and this obsession everyone has with like democracy is the only legitimate government form. Is it's the fact, the assumption is the more power someone has, automatically the worse of a situation, or the more power someone has, automatically the more corrupt they are, and the worse form of a government it is. But if we look back to Plato in Republic, it had nothing. It had nothing to do with how powerful someone is. It had to do with how virtuous versus vicious, how wise or unwise, how virtuous or vicious their soul was. Right? So what made a tyrant in Plato's view was somebody having a tyrannical soul, or that is a soul that's completely corrupted by disorder and ruled by the appetites, ruled by the impulses of the lower wills, and not governed by reason. Right? That was what made a tyrant, not having a lot of power, but having a lot of power and having a very corrupted soul. And this is something worth pushing back on, is the idea that is it necessarily automatically a bad thing for someone to have a lot of power if they're actually a good and virtuous ruler? Well, I don't think it is. And I think Hobbes makes a really interesting case for why it's worth considering something like monarchy. So let's see, this is only a 6 minute, um, 6 minute, what is it? Yeah, 6 minute, 45 seconds. Let's just watch this. Let's just watch this and talk a little political philosophy.
Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century English philosopher who's on hand to guide us through one of the thorniest issues of politics. To what extent should we patiently obey rulers, especially those who are not very good, and to what extent should we start revolutions and depose governments in search of a better world?
Okay, so you see why I wanted to do this video on the heels of the American Revolution video, right? I mean, this is kind of relevant. Like, on what basis, on what basis is a government considered legitimate? By what basis should somebody be seeking to start a revolution or whatnot?
Hobbes' thinking is inseparable from one major event that began when he was 64 years old and was to mark him so deeply it coloured all his subsequent thinking. remarkably, he died when he was 91, and so everything he's remembered for today, he wrote after the age of 60. This event was the
Wow.
English Civil War, a
That is kind of crazy, by the way, just to consider. Um, because, back in the 17th century, uh, when he lived, people didn't live quite as long as today. There are some misconceptions about that. People did live longer back then than we think. But it was definitely a lot less common for somebody to live till 91. So it's kind of crazy that, like, all his writing is from his 60s and 70s and 80s. And that's what he's most known for. But now, so just for some historical context, I'll let him give the context, but he's talking about an event called the English Civil War. So when we say Civil War, we think of it as, we associate that in the US with our American Civil War in the 19th century. Well, back in the 17th century, the English had a civil war, and it was actually over um, the powers of the monarch, and it was over monarchists. It was between monarchists who supported having a stronger monarch with more absolute power, and parliamentarians, or hats as they were called, who wanted to limit the monarch's power, who wanted to advocate for Parliament's power, and there were among them even some who were radical Republicans. Not Republican in the sense of the political party in 21st century America, not the Republican Party as we know that today, but Republicans as in they supported there were some of the parliamentarians who supported doing away with the monarchy altogether. Not all of them. It depends. There's a very complicated history behind it. But so this is in the 17th century. This is about 100 years before the American Revolution. The English are having their own civil war. And oh, and I'm sorry. So why that's important is because um, this is what the event that Thomas Hobbes was witnessing in his life in the 17th century is the English Civil War, and it's something that deeply informs the way he came to think about these things and to think about political philosophy. I'll let this guy explain it more though.
English Civil War, a vicious, divisive, costly, and murderous conflict that
Yep.
raged across England for almost a decade and pitted the forces of king against parliament, leading to the deaths of some 200,000 people on both sides.
Jeez.
Hobbes was by nature a deeply peaceful and cautious man. He hated violence of all kinds, a disposition that had begun at the age of 4, when his own father, a clergyman, was disgraced and abandoned his wife and family after he'd got into a fight with another vicar on the steps of his parish church in a village in Wiltshire.
I actually didn't know that. I didn't know that little biographic background to Hobbes. That's kind of interesting. And I'm sure there's somebody who could have a field day maybe engaging in some psychoanalysis of like how Hobbes's struggle with fatherlessness has impacted his political philosophy and desire to want to have like a paternalistic, authoritative figure ruling over things.
The work for which we chiefly remember Hobbes, Leviathan,
This is a
was
famous
published in
work.
1651. It is the most definitive, persuasive, and eloquent statement ever produced as to why one should obey government authority, even of a very imperfect kind, in order to avoid the risk of chaos and bloodshed. To understand
Yeah, so this is a very famous and important and significant work by Hobbes, Leviathan. Now, he discusses a lot of things in Leviathan, but this is one of the main things he's arguing for is monarchy, and in particular, absolute monarchy. And in particular, he argues for it, some of it's based in his assumption about human nature. He famously refers to, the human condition as being, short, nasty, brutish, and violent. It's that he would regard it as sort of the natural human condition for people to kill each other and be violent and slip into chaos. And so this is why Hobbes would say we create, governments, and in particular governments with strong rulers at their head, and governments with strong executive figure, to stand as a sovereign between us and our most violent and destructive nature, right? And this actually would the Leviathan is like a metaphor for the beast within us and this destructive primal nature within us. And the sovereign is meant to, the monarch is meant to stand between us and the Leviathan, the beast of our ultimate nature.
Understand the background of Hobbes's conservatism, it helps to realize that across Western Europe in the 17th century, political theorists were beginning to ask, with a new directness, on what basis subjects should obey their rulers.
Yep.
For centuries,
This is where this is basically at the beginning of this is getting into the Enlightenment, the 17th century. This is the beginning of the Enlightenment, in a period of philosophical liberalism in the Western world, and an increasing. Also, we're still like 100 years out from Kant, but we're going to see as a part of this Enlightenment period an increasing move towards, questioning uh, traditional sources, heteronymous sources of authority, like the church, like monarchy, these institutions that traditionally held authoritative power over us in our lives as these very old, built on tradition, as external sources of authority beyond ourselves. That's what heteronymous means, right? It means governed by something different, governed by something outside of you. There's an increasing move towards autonomy, and that, as that maps onto political philosophy, being politically autonomous and determining, your own fate politically, and as a part of this, a move towards things like philosophical liberalism and democracy. Um, and so that is kind of part of the context of, Hobbes is sort of contemporary to some of the beginnings of this Enlightenment period. And in some way, that's a context of what he's responding to philosophically.
back into the Middle Ages, there'd been a standard answer to this, contained in a theory called the divine right of kings.
Yeah.
This was a blunt, simple, but highly effective theory, stating that it was none other than God who'd appointed all kings, and that one should obey these monarchs for one clear reason, because God said so, and he would send you to hell if you didn't agree. But this was no longer proving quite so persuasive.
I think that's a bit reductive. I think that's a bit reductive. But the basic idea of divine right, um, it's if we go back into like a pre-Christian society in antiquity, a lot of rulers would claim legitimacy by claiming to literally be gods in some way, or demigods, or descendant of gods. Julius Caesar painted his face red in order to liken himself to Jupiter. And Octavian, would then have him deified as a god after his death, so that he could claim to be the son of a god. Um, in Viking society, pre-Christian Viking society, a lot of the chieftains, Viking chieftains and jarls and whatnot, would claim to be descended from Odin. So you would have a common claim to divinity in antiquity and in pre-Christian societies as a way to legitimize why somebody has some sort of a right to rule. But what you get after Christianity is actually, ironically, a somewhat more liberal assumption that actually all human beings are equal under God and have sort of an equal value, and no man is like divine. All human beings are mortal and sinful and kind of equal under God in that regard. And so, if that's the case, then, well, now you can't claim divinity, at least not directly, to legitimize your rule. So, this is what started the trend in the Middle Ages of instead turning to the idea of the divine right to rule. It's to say, well, look, as a man, I'm but another human being, no greater than you lowly serfs beneath me. I'm as human as you are, and you're as human as I am. And again, in a way that's actually a lot more progressive of a view than what came before in antiquity. But the claim would be, while I may be every bit as much of a man as you are, and not like some god among men. It just so happens that the one God there is wants me to rule, wills for me to rule, right? I have a divine right. God has sanctioned my rule in a way that he hasn't for you. So it's interesting because there's still this claim to divinity and an appeal to divinity to gain political legitimacy, but it's a more indirect appeal to divinity, right? It's an appeal to divinity that creates some space between the ruler and the divine, so that the ruler is not actually deifying him or herself, and is instead actually continuing to maintain. Again, if you think about it, an almost somewhat more progressive view that I am, all of us are kind of ultimately equal in being human beings. You know, I'm no more of a man. I'm not a god among men, says the medieval ruler. It's just that God wills for me to rule. It may sound like an old school way of going about political legitimacy by today's standards, but back then that was actually a far more progressive view than in the ancient world that came before, where people would just straight up claim to be gods or demigods or descendant of gods. Let's continue.
Persuasive to many thoughtful people, who argued that the right to rule ultimately lay not with kings, but with ordinary people who gave kings power, and therefore should only expect to take orders from kings so long as, but only so long, as things were working out quite well for them. This was known as the social contract theory of government. Hobbes could see that the divine right of kings...
So just to explain that a little bit, the social contractarianism it's actually a much older view than it's commonly associated with Hobbes in modern philosophy, but it's a much older view. It actually goes all the way back, like many things, to ancient Greek philosophy, and I'm thinking specifically Book 2 of Plato's Republic. There's a character in that dialogue named Glaucon who essentially gives this exact view. He describes justice as sort of arising as this sort of lesser of the evils, begrudging compromise everybody makes, under the idea that it's sort of like almost like a prisoner's dilemma. It's this idea that, well, I really, what I really want, it's again operating under the assumption that people are very kind of deep down, kind of just want to benefit themselves. And so the social contractarian view would be to say that, well, really, if I could do whatever I wanted and get away with it, I would just, act unjustly towards everybody and just enrich myself at everybody else's expense. Um, while nobody does the same to me. That's like my ideal world. But the problem with that is there are other people out there who are stronger than me and bigger than me, and people who could, like, act unjustly towards me, and in a way I would be powerless to fight against. So not because I necessarily want everybody to be equal, not because I necessarily want things to be this way, but just because I view a world where I have to give up what I really want to do, dominating other people, but the trade-off is other people aren't allowed to dominate me. While I really ideally would want the world where just I can dominate everybody, but nobody can dominate me. In reality, unless I set up some kind of a social contract system of government, then it's going to create a world where I maybe am able to dominate some people, but other people are easily able to dominate me because they're bigger than me and stronger than me and more powerful than me. And so it's sort of almost like this begrudging compromise that I just say, okay, fine. I'll, as badly as I want to dominate you and take your stuff and do what I want to you, as badly as I want to do that, I'm so much more fearful of other people doing that same thing to me and dominating me and taking my stuff, that I will begrudgingly voluntarily give up my ability to steal your stuff and dominate you in exchange for everybody else not being allowed to take my stuff or dominate me. So it's just sort of this very it's a very cynical way of looking at something like justice. It's or political philosophy. It's that it's all just this sort of cynical, calculated compromise everybody's making. So that's social contractarianism.
King's theory was nonsense, and what's more, was going to be increasingly unpersuasive as religious observance declined. He himself was, privately, an atheist. At the same time, Hobbes was deeply scared of the possible consequences of the social contract theory, which could encourage people...
Hobbes was an atheist, by the way, and also very materialistic for that reason. And perhaps his social contractarian view and his political philosophy, you could argue, is in some ways informed by that atheistic, materialistic worldview.
Of the possible consequences of the social contract theory, which could encourage people to depose rulers whenever they felt a little unhappy with their lot. Hobbes had received a first-hand account of the beheading of King Charles I on a scaffold in front of the banqueting house of the Palace of Whitehall in 1649, and his intellectual labours were directed at making sure that such ghastly primitive scenes would never be repeated. So, in Leviathan, Hobbes puts forward an ingenious argument that tries to marry up social contract theory with a defence of total obedience and submission to traditional authority. The way he did this was to take his readers back in time to a period he called the state of nature.
So now he's going to get into his, the original state, natural state for human beings. By the way, just some context. So this is common in political philosophy. A lot of political philosophers will sort of base a whole lot of their political philosophy on their view of what the sort of natural default state of human beings is. And this natural default state of human beings, this would mean like pre-agrarian, like cavemen essentially, prehistoric, pre-agrarian human beings, when they're just left to their own devices without any civilization. How do they tend to organize themselves and congregate? This is a common starting point in political philosophy, not just Hobbes. A lot of thinkers do this. And part of why it's just kind of interesting, the reason why that's so common in political philosophy is because if you think about it, it's meant to kind of try to set up a certain almost a certain teleological structure, almost a sort of virtue ethics, almost like it's essentially almost making that kind of an evaluative argument, where it's saying if we look at the natural default state of human beings and how human beings are kind of organized, or how they tend to organize themselves naturally, what it's in our nature to do socially, then we can look to that as a model for figuring out how we should normatively organize ourselves in a post-agrarian, now post-industrial, modern world in civilization. With, if we think of politics as just taking the basic social structures of like the pre-agrarian tribe and scaling them up on a massive level. The kind of argument that a lot of political philosophers make, even if not explicitly, the implication is, well, if this is how human beings function naturally, then this is how they would best function now if we were to set up our government, in a way that's sort of emulating these structures that are within human nature, that it's within the human condition to emulate, or that it's within the human condition to implement socially. It's almost kind of a weird little virtue ethics that's being engaged in, or sort of a teleological appeal. But let's continue.
Before there were kings of any kind, and to get them to think about how governments would have arisen in the first place. Key to Hobbes's argument was that the state of nature would not have been a pretty place, because humans, left to their own devices, without a central authority to keep them in awe, would quickly have descended into squabbling, infighting, and intolerable bickering. It would have been a little like the English Civil War, but with people in bearskins bashing each other around with flint tools.
So there's, you see kind of some of the stuff we talked about already, right? That, what is this default state of human nature to Hobbes prior to civilization? It's just everybody killing each other and trying to dominate each other and taking what they want from each other. And notice again how we see the way in which the history of the philosophy, the historical events surrounding Thomas Hobbes and contextualizing his thought, most notably the English Civil War and all of the chaos and violence and disorder that went on then, is we see how that's directly informing and impacting the way he's thinking about social and political philosophy, right? Seeing, oh, this is what happens when the government breaks down, is everybody just like freaking kills each other. So that must be what it's in human nature to do, and therefore that must be why we appoint monarchs and set up governments in the first place, to save ourselves from that fate. The monarch or the sovereign, standing as that great defender between us and the Leviathan, the primal monster of our inner nature.
In Hobbes's famous formulation, life in the state of nature would have been nasty, brutish, and short.
Nasty,
As a
brutish, and
result,
short.
out of fear and dread of chaos, people were led to form governments. They had done this willingly, as social contract theorists maintained, but also under considerable compulsion, fleeing into the arms of strong authority. which they therefore, Hobbes argued, had a subsequent duty to keep obeying, with only a few rights to complain if they didn't like it. The only right that people might have to protest about an absolute ruler, or Leviathan as Hobbes called him, was if he directly threatened to kill them. However, if the ruler merely
Well, okay, I guess I screwed up a little bit. I kept describing the Leviathan as the beast of our human nature, but I guess he's saying the Leviathan is the monarch. So maybe I screwed up a little bit, but I just wanted to be clear that, I mean, the analogy still stands. All right, if the Leviathan is the monarch, the point is the monarch is like the sovereign is the defender between us and in our primal nature. That analogy still stands. I just mixed up the words.
stifled opposition, imposed onerous taxes, crippled the economy, and locked up dissidents willy-nilly, this was absolutely no reason to take to the streets and demand a change of government. As Hobbes wrote, "Though of so unlimited a power men may fancy many evil consequences, yet the consequences of the want of it, which is perpetual war of every man against his neighbour, are much worse." He admitted that a ruler might come along with an inclination to do wicked deeds, but the people would still have a duty to obey this person, as human affairs cannot be without some inconvenience. But this inconvenience is anyway the fault of the people, not the sovereign, because, as Hobbes adds, if men could rule themselves, there would be no need at all of a common coercive power.
If men could rule themselves, there would be no need at all for a common coercive power. It's a very cynical statement, but again, the idea is um, the monarch is necessary to avoid being consumed and destroyed by our own nature.
As he went on, "He that complaineth of injury from his sovereign complaineth of that whereof he is the author himself, and therefore ought not to accuse any man but himself." Hobbes's theory was dark, cautious, and not especially hopeful about government. In our more optimistic moments, we want him to be wrong, but it seems Hobbes's name will always be relevant and fresh again when revolutions, motivated by a search for liberty, go horribly awry. Hobbes maintained in the preface to Leviathan that he had written the book without partiality, without application, and without other design than to set before men's eyes the mutual relationship between protection and obedience.
Yeah. Well, that's the end, I think. But yep. So what I'm a little disappointed in is this video only really went over like the basic stuff behind why, the general reasoning behind why Hobbes, favors a stronger, more authoritative government in general, and his kind of social philosophy and as it informs his political philosophy. But it didn't actually get into all the like arguments he gives in favor of why monarchism specifically. And there's some really interesting ones about how, a monarchy is that wherein the public will, the public interest and the public good become wholly one and the same with the private interest and will of the sovereign of the monarch. Only in a monarchy can you actually have that complete merging between what is public and what is the public interest and what is the private interest of the monarch. And this is part of what makes democracies and oligarchies so destructive, is because it's always a house divided against itself. In the Hobbesian language, it's always a bunch of different people with different competing private interests that therefore tears itself apart for that reason. But with a monarchy, the entirety of the public interest, rather than being split up and divided between all these different private interests, is all wholly unified in one and the same with the private interest of one strong ruler. Um, and then in that same regard, that means the ruler kind of naturally regards all that is public property as his private property, but in a way where everybody wants to take care of their private property, right? So there's kind of this weird merging of mutual interest between the public and the private, nature of the monarch. As I've appealed to Plato multiple times before. I think he has a really good point that if you actually have a wise and virtuous ruler, it's actually a good thing for them to have a lot of power to implement that wisdom and virtue. and rule well, and that, constantly impeding them can be counterproductive. Moreover, monarchs are able to conceive of and then carry out long-term plans. A monarch can spend years, decades carrying out grand projects. And this is why we see historically, Octavian in Rome, Augustus Caesar, and some of these great monarchs throughout history carry out and end up overseeing these elaborate, great works of architecture and art and renovation, and they accomplish such great feats. But part of why is because they have the time, they have years, they have decades of a whole rule to carry out, conceive of and carry out these grand public projects, and to do so as ambitions that are one and the same with their own personal and private ambitions. There's actually a lot of good that can come out of that. And just think, in a contemporary democracy in the 21st century, when's the last time you've seen some great work of architecture completed, some great, renovation, this cultural and civilizational flourishing? You just don't really see that anymore, because everything's always a house divided against itself, where people are constantly engaged in these very short-term, they have term limits and short terms, the rulers in these democracies, and therefore end up just spending with the short period of time they're in power, just focusing on enriching themselves privately as much as they can before they get out of power. And again, enriching themselves privately is something completely detached from the public interest, because the public interest is represented by a group of many people with different competing private interests, a house divided against itself. If you like my philosophically themed content and you'd like to see more, help get my channel off the ground by remembering to like, comment, share, and subscribe.